The morning sun was rising over the small Italian village of San Lorenzo. The year was 1987, and the streets were narrow and made of old stones. In this quiet village there lived a young woman named Maria Benedetta. She was 23 years old with dark brown eyes and a gentle smile that could make anyone feel peaceful. Maria was not like the other young women in the village. While they dreamed of marriage and fancy dresses, Maria spent her days inside the ancient walls of the convent of the Sacred Heart. Maria had joined the convent 2 years ago, leaving behind a life that was filled with both beauty and pain. The villagers often whispered about her past. They said she came from a wealthy family in Rome. They said her father was a famous music teacher who had taught many important people. They said Maria herself had once been a piano student with a gift so rare that people called her a miracle child. But something terrible had happened, something that made Maria run away from music forever and hide herself behind the walls of the convent. The convent was an old building with thick stone walls and tall windows. Inside there was a chapel where the nuns prayed 5 times a day. There was a garden where they grew vegetables and flowers. There was a kitchen where they cooked simple meals. And in one dusty corner of the main hall there stood an old grand piano. This piano had been donated to the convent many years ago by a rich man who hoped it would bring joy to the sisters. But no one in the convent knew how to play it. The piano sat there, silent and covered with dust, like a sleeping giant waiting to wake up. The Mother Superior of the convent was a tall woman named Sister Agnes. She was 70 years old with white hair and eyes that could see deep into people's hearts. Sister Agnes had noticed something special about Maria from the very first day. She saw how Maria's fingers would sometimes move in the air as if they were playing invisible keys. She saw how Maria would stop walking whenever she passed the old piano, looking at it with a mixture of love and fear. Sister Agnes knew that Maria was running from something, but she was wise enough to wait for the right time to ask. The village of San Lorenzo was a place where everyone knew everyone's business. The people there were mostly simple farmers and shopkeepers. They went to church on Sundays, celebrated festivals together, and gossiped about each other during the rest of the week. The convent was respected by most villagers, but there was one group of men who loved to make fun of the nuns. These men would gather at the local tavern every evening, drinking wine and telling jokes. Their leader was a man named Giuseppe Moretti, a 45-year-old mechanic with a loud voice and a bitter heart. Giuseppe had his own painful history with the church. His wife had died 10 years ago, and he blamed God for taking her away. Since then, he had stopped believing in anything. He would often stand outside the convent walls and shout mean things at the nuns. He would say that they were wasting their lives. He would say that their prayers were useless. The nuns ignored him most of the time, turning the other cheek as their faith taught them to do. But Giuseppe's words still hurt, especially the younger sisters who were not yet strong in their spiritual armor. One autumn evening, the village council announced something exciting. A famous music competition was going to be held in San Lorenzo during the Christmas festival. Musicians from all over Italy would come to compete. The winner would receive a large sum of money and the honor of playing at the Grand Cathedral in Rome. The news spread through the village like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it. The tavern became louder than ever as people discussed who might enter the competition. Giuseppe and his friends found this news particularly amusing. They started making jokes about who in the village might be foolish enough to compete against professional musicians. One evening, as they were drinking their wine, one of Giuseppe's friends pointed toward the convent and laughed. He said that maybe the nuns should enter the competition. Maybe they could pray the piano to play itself. This joke made everyone at the table roar with laughter. Giuseppe slapped his knee and wiped tears from his eyes. He found the idea absolutely hilarious. But then Giuseppe had an idea that made his eyes shine with mischief. He stood up from his chair and raised his glass high in the air. He announced loudly so that everyone in the tavern could hear him. He said that if any nun from that convent could play the piano in the competition, if any of those holy women could actually make real music come out of that dusty old instrument, then he would repent. He would go back to church. He would apologize to every nun he had ever insulted. He would become a believer again. The tavern exploded with laughter and cheers. Everyone thought it was the funniest bet they had ever heard. Someone ran to tell the news to others. By the next morning, the whole village knew about Giuseppe's bold declaration. Inside the convent, the news of Giuseppe's bet reached the ears of the sisters during their morning meal. Some of them were hurt by the mockery. Others simply shook their heads and said they would pray for Giuseppe's troubled soul. But Sister Agnes sat quietly, stirring her soup and thinking deeply. Her eyes moved toward Maria, who was sitting at the far end of the table with her head bowed down. Sister Agnes noticed that Maria's hands were trembling slightly, and there was a look of deep conflict on her face. After the meal, Sister Agnes asked Maria to walk with her in the garden. The autumn leaves were falling from the trees, covering the ground with shades of orange and gold. The two women walked in silence for a few minutes before Sister Agnes finally spoke. She told Maria that she had been watching her for 2 years now. She said she knew that Maria was hiding something, carrying a burden that was too heavy for her young shoulders. She said that God sends us challenges not to break us but to help us grow stronger. Then she stopped walking and looked directly into Maria's eyes. She asked Maria one simple question. Could she play the piano? Maria's eyes filled with tears. Her lips trembled as memories she had tried so hard to forget came flooding back into her mind. She stood there in the garden, surrounded by falling leaves, and the pain of her past wrapped around her heart like chains. She did not answer Sister Agnes. She could not answer. Instead, she turned and walked quickly back to her room, closing the door behind her. That night, she did not come to dinner. The other sisters whispered among themselves, wondering what had happened. But Sister Agnes told them to give Maria space. She believed that sometimes the deepest healing begins with the deepest tears. In her small room, Maria sat on her narrow bed and stared at the wall. Her mind traveled back in time to her childhood home in Rome. She remembered the grand piano that stood in her father's music room. She remembered sitting on her father's lap when she was just 4 years old, her tiny fingers pressing the keys for the first time. She remembered the joy in her father's eyes when he realized that his daughter had a natural gift for music. Those memories were beautiful, but they were followed by darker ones. Memories of the accident, memories of loss, memories of the day when she swore she would never touch a piano again. The night grew darker and the convent became silent. But Maria could not sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the wind outside her window, and she knew that something was about to change. Giuseppe's bet had stirred up feelings she thought she had buried forever. The challenge was not really about proving him wrong. It was about facing her own fears. It was about finding the courage to remember who she once was. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Maria made a decision. She would go to the dusty old piano in the main hall. She would lift the lid. She would see if her fingers still remembered the magic they once knew. The journey that would change everything was about to begin. 3 days had passed since Sister Agnes asked Maria that painful question in the garden. During those 3 days, Maria went through her daily duties like a ghost. She helped in the kitchen, she attended prayers, she worked in the garden, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. The other sisters noticed the change in her, but they respected her silence. In the convent, everyone understood that each person carried their own cross. And sometimes that cross was too heavy to explain with words. On the 4th night, when everyone was asleep, Maria found herself walking through the dark corridors of the convent. The stone floors were cold under her bare feet, and the moonlight coming through the tall windows created strange shadows on the walls. She did not plan to go anywhere specific, but her feet seemed to know where they wanted to take her. Step by step, she moved closer to the main hall where the old piano waited in its dusty corner. When she reached the hall, she stopped at the doorway and stared at the instrument. The piano looked almost magical in the moonlight, its dark wood shining like something from a dream. Maria's heart was beating so fast that she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were sweating and her legs felt weak. She stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. Finally, with a deep breath that seemed to come from the very bottom of her soul, she took her first step toward the piano, The dust on the piano lid was thick. When Maria lifted it, a small cloud rose into the air and made her cough. The keys underneath were yellowed with age, some of them cracked, but they were still there, waiting to be touched. Maria sat down on the old wooden bench. She placed her fingers on the keys but did not press them. She just sat there, feeling the smooth surface under her fingertips, remembering everything she had tried so hard to forget. Her father's name was Antonio Benedetta, and he was one of the most respected piano teachers in all of Rome. He had taught students from wealthy families, students who went on to become famous musicians. But his greatest joy was teaching his own daughter. Maria showed signs of musical genius when she was barely old enough to walk. By the time she was 6, she could play pieces that adults struggled with. By the time she was 10, she was performing at small concerts, amazing everyone who heard her. People called her the Angel of Rome. They said her fingers were blessed by God himself, but Antonio was more than just Maria's teacher. He was her best friend, her protector, her whole world. Maria's mother had died giving birth to her, so Antonio raised Maria alone. He poured all his love into his daughter, and she adored him with her entire heart. The two of them were inseparable. Every evening they would sit together at the grand piano, playing four-hand pieces and laughing at their mistakes. Those evenings were the happiest times of Maria's life. The tragedy happened when Maria was 18 years old. It was a winter night, and they were driving home from a concert in Milan. Maria had performed brilliantly that evening, receiving a standing ovation from the audience. Antonio was so proud of his daughter that he could not stop smiling. They talked and laughed as their car moved through the dark, snowy roads. Antonio told Maria about his plans for her future. He said she would become the greatest pianist in the world. He said her mother would have been so proud. Then came the truck. It appeared out of nowhere, its headlights blinding them for a split second. Antonio tried to turn the steering wheel, but the road was icy and the car spun out of control. The next few moments were a blur of screaming metal and breaking glass. When Maria woke up, she was in a hospital bed with bandages covering her hands. A doctor was standing beside her, looking at her with sad eyes. He told her that her father did not survive the crash. He told her that she had been in a coma for 3 weeks. He told her that the injuries to her hands had damaged the nerves, and the doctors were not sure if she would ever play the piano again. Maria did not cry when she heard this news. She did not scream or shout. Something inside her simply broke. The light that had always shone in her eyes went dark. When her hands healed and the doctors said she could try playing again, she refused. She could not bear to touch the instrument that reminded her of everything she had lost. The piano had been her connection to her father, and now her father was gone. Playing without him felt like a betrayal. So she stopped. She gave away her father's grand piano. She sold the house in Rome. She gave all her money to charity and joined the convent of the Sacred Heart, hoping to find peace in a life of prayer and silence. Now, 5 years later, she sat at another piano in the middle of the night, with tears streaming down her face. Her fingers trembled as they rested on the keys. She closed her eyes and asked God for strength. She asked her father for forgiveness. Then, very slowly, she pressed down on a single key. The note rang out through the empty hall, clear and pure, filling the silence like a voice from heaven. The sound made Maria gasp. It was as if the note had unlocked something deep inside her. More notes followed, hesitant at first, then stronger. Her fingers began to move across the keys, playing a simple melody that her father had taught her when she was just a child. The music was rusty and full of mistakes, but it was music nonetheless. Maria played with her eyes closed, letting the notes guide her, letting the memories wash over her without fighting them anymore. She did not know how long she played. Time seemed to stop in that moonlit hall. But when she finally opened her eyes, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Sister Agnes was standing in the doorway, her white nightgown glowing in the dim light, and her old face was covered with tears. The Mother Superior had heard the music from her room and had come to see who was playing. Now she stood there, watching Maria with an expression of such deep love and understanding that Maria felt her soul being healed. "Sister," Agnes walked slowly toward Maria and sat down beside her on the bench. She did not say anything at first. She just took Maria's hand and held it gently. Then she spoke in a soft voice. She told Maria that her father's love was still alive in her music. She told Maria that running from her gift was not protecting her father's memory but rather hiding it. She told Maria that the best way to honor those we have lost is to let their light shine through us into the world. Maria listened to these words, and something shifted inside her heart. For the first time in 5 years, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe Sister Agnes was right. Maybe her music was not a source of pain, but a bridge to her father's memory. Maybe playing the piano could be an act of love rather than an act of grief. The thought was terrifying, but it was also strangely beautiful. Sister Agnes then mentioned Giuseppe's bet. She said that perhaps this was God's way of giving Maria a reason to come back to music. She said that proving Giuseppe wrong could heal more than just Maria's heart. It could remind the whole village that miracles still happen. It could show everyone that faith is not just about prayers and rituals, but about the courage to face our deepest fears. Maria thought about this for a long time. The idea of performing in public again made her stomach twist with fear. But there was also a small voice inside her that whispered, maybe, just maybe, she could do it. As the first rays of morning light began to appear through the windows, Maria made a decision that would change the course of her life. She told Sister Agnes that she would try. She would practice every night after everyone went to sleep. She would work on rebuilding the skills she had abandoned. She would face her fears one note at a time. And when the Christmas competition arrived, she would step onto that stage and play for her father, for Sister Agnes, for all the doubters who thought that a nun could never make beautiful music. The journey would be long and difficult, but Maria was ready to begin. With Sister Agnes by her side and her father's spirit in her heart, she believed that anything was possible. The morning of the competition dawned bright and clear, the winter sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of San Lorenzo. Maria rose before the rest of the convent and went to the chapel to pray. The silence wrapped around her, like a warm blanket, as she knelt before the altar and spoke to God in the quiet language of the heart. She did not ask for victory. She asked only for the courage to be true to herself and the music she loved. The village theater was buzzing with activity by mid-morning. Crews set up lights and arranged flowers on the stage. Sound technicians tested microphones and speakers. Photographers from regional newspapers positioned themselves to capture the event. The competition was the biggest cultural happening San Lorenzo had seen in decades, and everyone wanted to witness history being made. The competitors arrived one by one, each making a grand entrance. The young prodigy from Milan came with his proud parents and a small entourage. The concert pianist from Florence wore an elegant gown that sparkled under the lights. The passionate woman from Naples swept into the theater like a queen, demanding attention from everyone present. They greeted each other with polite smiles that hid fierce ambition. Each one believed they deserved to win. Maria arrived quietly through a side door, accompanied by Sister Agnes and 3 other nuns from the convent. She wore her simple brown habit, freshly washed and pressed. Her only adornment was a small silver cross that had belonged to her father. The other competitors glanced at her and whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others giggled behind their hands. Maria kept her eyes forward, and her head high, drawing strength from the sisters walking beside her. The draw was held to determine the performance order. Each competitor picked a number from a velvet bag. Maria drew number 7, placing her in the middle of the program. Sister Agnes said this was perfect. Maria would not have to perform first, when the audience was still settling in, nor last when everyone was tired. She would play when the crowd was engaged and alert, ready to hear something special. Giuseppe arrived at the theater early, securing a seat near the back. He wore a clean shirt for the first time in months and had even combed his hair. His sister Elena sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. Other villagers filled the seats around them, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and excitement. The professionals from out of town sat near the front, looking confident and slightly bored. They expected an easy competition against rural musicians and one ridiculous nun. The competition began at precisely 2 o'clock. The first performer was a young man from Bologna, who played a technically correct but emotionally flat rendition of a Mozart sonata. The audience applauded politely. The second performer was better. A woman from Venice whose interpretation of Debussy showed real artistry. As each competitor took the stage, the judges made notes on their scorecards, their faces revealing nothing. Backstage, Maria listened to the other performers while trying to calm her racing heart. Sister Agnes sat beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement. The sounds of applause came and went, each round signaling that another competitor had finished. Maria counted the performances in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then it was her turn. The stage manager called her name, and Maria stood on trembling legs. Sister Agnes embraced her and whispered that God was with her. Maria walked toward the stage, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. As she stepped into the bright lights, she heard the audience react. There were gasps of surprise, a few uncomfortable laughs, and a general buzz of disbelief. The nun in her simple habit looked completely out of place among the glamorous performers who had come before. Maria walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. The instrument was magnificent, far superior to the old piano at the convent. She placed her fingers on the cool keys and took a deep breath. The audience fell silent. In the back row, Giuseppe leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the strange figure on the stage. Somewhere in the crowd, Professor Marino watched with quiet anticipation. Maria began with the Chopin Nocturne. The first notes emerged soft and delicate, floating into the silence like petals falling from a flower. The audience, which had been prepared to be unimpressed, suddenly grew very still. This was not what they expected. This was not the fumbling of an amateur, but the touch of a true artist. As the melody unfolded, people found themselves holding their breath. Some closed their eyes to listen more deeply. Others felt unexpected tears forming. The nocturne ended, and there was a moment of stunned silence before the applause erupted. It was genuine applause, not polite clapping, but the kind of response that comes when an audience has been truly moved. Maria allowed herself a small smile before beginning her second piece. The Beethoven sonata was a completely different experience. Where the Chopin had been gentle, the Beethoven was powerful and dramatic. Maria attacked the keys with passion, her body swaying with the rhythm, her face intense with concentration. The audience watched in amazement as this small woman in her simple clothes produced sounds that filled the entire theater. The professional competitors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had expected to be entertained by a failure. Instead, they were watching a serious threat emerge. When the sonata concluded, the applause was even louder than before. Some people rose to their feet. Others shouted words of praise. Giuseppe sat frozen in his seat, tears streaming down his face without shame. He did not understand what was happening to him. He only knew that something he had thought was dead inside him had suddenly come back to life. Now came the moment Maria had feared most. She adjusted herself on the bench and looked out at the audience. In a clear voice that surprised even herself, she announced that her final piece was a composition written by her father for her when she was a child. She said her father had died 5 years ago, and this was the first time the piece would be performed in public. The audience grew very quiet. Even the other competitors stopped their whispering and listened. Maria placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes and called forth the image of her father's face. Then she began to play. The melody started simply, a sweet tune that sounded like a lullaby. But as it developed, it grew more complex, weaving together threads of joy and sorrow, love and loss. Maria played with her entire being, pouring into the music everything she had been afraid to feel for 5 long years. She played for her father, for the years they had shared, for the future they would never have. She played for herself, for her pain and her healing, for the person she had been and the person she was becoming. The audience sat spellbound. Some people wept openly. Others clasped their hands over their hearts. Elena held her brother's arm tightly, feeling him tremble beside her. Giuseppe's walls, the walls he had built so carefully after his wife's death, were crumbling with every note. He thought of all the years he had spent running from grief, all the anger and bitterness he had used to shield himself. And now this music was stripping everything away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable and somehow lighter than he had felt in a decade. The composition built to its climax, a passage of such beauty that several audience members later said they felt transported to another world. Then it descended gently into the final notes, fading like the last light of sunset. Maria played the final chord and held it, letting it ring through the theater until silence returned. For a long moment no one moved. The theater was as quiet as a church. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, a single person began to clap. Others joined, and within seconds the entire theater was thundering with applause. People jumped to their feet, shouting and cheering. They called Maria's name, their voices filled with emotion. Some threw flowers toward the stage. Others wiped tears from their eyes while continuing to clap. Maria sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. She looked out at the standing crowd and saw faces transformed by emotion. She saw strangers hugging each other, moved by shared experience. She saw the other competitors standing and applauding, their arrogance replaced by respect. And in the back of the theater she saw a man she did not recognize standing with his hands pressed together, tears streaming down his weathered face. It was Giuseppe, and even from a distance, Maria could see that something profound had changed in him. Sister Agnes rushed onto the stage and embraced Maria. The other nuns followed, surrounding their sister with love and celebration. The audience continued applauding for what felt like forever, unwilling to let the moment end. Maria stood among her sisters, her heart fuller than it had ever been, and she knew with absolute certainty that her father was watching from somewhere beyond the clouds. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of Maria's life. Every night after the last prayers were finished and the convent fell into silence, she would sneak to the main hall and sit at the old piano. Her fingers, which had once danced across the keys with ease, now felt stiff and clumsy. The nerve damage from the accident had left her hands weaker than before. Some nights she could barely press down the keys hard enough to make a sound. Other nights, her fingers would cramp so badly that she had to stop playing and cry from the pain, but Maria refused to give up. She remembered her father's voice telling her that greatness does not come from talent alone. Greatness comes from the willingness to fail again and again until success finally arrives. So she pushed through the pain. She practiced scales and simple exercises until her hands screamed for rest. She played the same pieces over and over, trying to rebuild the muscle memory that had faded during her years of silence. The progress was slow, painfully slow, but it was happening. Sister Agnes became Maria's biggest supporter during this time. The old woman would sometimes join Maria during her late-night practice sessions, sitting quietly in a chair and listening with her eyes closed. She never criticized or gave advice. She simply provided her presence, her warmth, her unwavering belief that Maria could do this. Whenever Maria wanted to quit, whenever the doubts became too loud in her head, she would look at Sister Agnes and find the strength to continue. The other nuns in the convent soon discovered Maria's secret. Sound travels easily through old stone buildings, and the music could not stay hidden forever. At first, the sisters were shocked. They had no idea that Maria possessed such a gift. Then curiosity turned into admiration. One by one, they started showing their support in small but meaningful ways. Sister Teresa would leave a warm cup of tea beside the piano before Maria's practice sessions. Sister Rosa would knead Maria's hands with healing oils to ease the cramping. Sister Catherine would pray extra prayers for Maria's success. The entire convent became united in this secret mission, their faith in Maria growing stronger with each passing day. Meanwhile, in the village, Giuseppe's bet had become legendary. Everyone was talking about it. The tavern was louder than ever as people debated whether any nun would actually dare to enter the competition. Giuseppe himself was enjoying the attention. He repeated his boast every night, getting more dramatic each time. He said he would walk on his knees to the church if a nun played in the competition. He said he would kiss the feet of every sister in the convent. He said he would admit that God was real and he was just a foolish old man. His friends laughed and cheered, buying him drinks and slapping his back. None of them believed for a second that anything would actually happen. But there was one person in the village who did not find Giuseppe's that funny at all. Her name was Elena Moretti, and she was Giuseppe's younger sister. Elena was a kind woman in her 50s who worked as the village school teacher. Unlike her brother, she had never lost her faith. She still went to church every Sunday, still said her prayers every night, still believed that God worked in mysterious ways. Elena loved her brother despite his bitterness, and she prayed every day that something would bring him back to the faith they had shared as children. Elena first heard the piano music one evening when she was walking past the convent on her way home from the school. She stopped in her tracks, amazed by what she was hearing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with both sorrow and hope. Elena listened until the music stopped, then hurried home with her heart pounding with excitement. She did not know who was playing, but she sensed that something wonderful was happening behind those ancient walls. The next evening, Elena returned to the same spot and listened again. This time, the music was even more beautiful. The player was clearly improving at a remarkable rate. Elena felt tears in her eyes as she listened. She thought about her brother's bet, and a wild hope began to grow in her heart. What if a nun really did enter the competition? What if Giuseppe's arrogant words actually came true? It seemed impossible, but Elena had learned long ago that God loves to do the impossible. Inside the convent, Maria was fighting her own battles. The physical challenges of playing with damaged hands were difficult enough, but the emotional challenges were even harder. Every time she played, memories of her father would flood her mind. She would see his face, hear his voice, feel his presence beside her on the piano bench. Sometimes these memories brought comfort. Other times, they brought unbearable grief. Maria had to learn how to welcome the memories without letting them destroy her. She had to find a way to turn her pain into power. Sister Agnes helped Maria through this process with her gentle wisdom. She taught Maria that grief is not something we overcome, but something we learn to carry. She said that the weight of loss never gets lighter, but our hearts get stronger, and eventually we find balance. She encouraged Maria to talk about her father, to share stories about him, to keep his memory alive through words as well as music. Slowly, Maria began to open up. She told Sister Agnes about the concerts she and her father had played together. She described the way his eyes would light up when she mastered a difficult piece. She laughed about his terrible jokes and his love for bad Italian opera. With each story, a piece of her broken heart began to heal. As the weeks turned into months, Maria's playing transformed. The stiffness in her fingers gradually disappeared. The pain became manageable. Her technique returned, and with it came something new, a depth of emotion that had not been there before. Maria had always been a gifted musician, but now she was becoming a great one. Her suffering had given her access to feelings that most musicians never experience. When she played sad music, you could hear real sorrow. When she played joyful music, you could hear hard-won hope. The piano was no longer just an instrument for Maria. It was an extension of her soul. Sister Agnes began to believe that Maria was ready for something bigger. She arranged for a piano tuner to come from the city to fix the old instrument. The man was surprised to find such a beautiful grand piano hidden in a convent. He spent a whole day adjusting the strings and hammers until the piano sang like new. When he left, he told Sister Agnes that whoever was playing the piano had a rare gift. He said he hoped to hear them perform someday. The Christmas competition was now just 8 weeks away. Registrations were closing soon, and Sister Agnes knew it was time to make a decision. One morning, she gathered all the sisters in the chapel and told them about Maria's journey. She explained how Maria had been a piano prodigy who had given up music after a terrible tragedy. She described Maria's brave decision to play again and her months of dedicated practice. Then she asked the sisters to vote on whether Maria should enter the competition on behalf of the convent. The vote was unanimous. Every single sister raised her hand in support. Tears flowed freely as the nuns embraced Maria and promised to pray for her success. Maria stood in the middle of the chapel, overwhelmed by the love surrounding her. She had spent so many years believing she was alone in the world. Now she realized she had a family, a community of women who believed in her even when she could not believe in herself. That afternoon, Sister Agnes walked to the village town hall with Maria by her side. They climbed the stone steps together and entered the building where registrations were being held. The clerk behind the desk looked up with surprise when he saw two nuns approaching. His surprise turned to shock when Sister Agnes announced that they wanted to register a participant for the music competition. The clerk asked for the name, and Sister Agnes spoke clearly for everyone in the room to hear. She said the name was Sister Maria, Benedetta of the Convent of the Sacred Heart. She said that Sister Maria would be performing solo piano. The clerk wrote down the information with shaking hands, already imagining the gossip this would create. Within hours, the news spread through San Lorenzo like wildfire. A nun had entered the music competition. Giuseppe's bet was no longer a joke. It was a challenge that was actually going to happen. The village divided into two camps. Some people laughed and said the nun would embarrass herself. Others quietly hoped for a miracle. Giuseppe himself received the news while he was working on a car at his garage. His friends expected him to laugh, but instead his face turned pale. For the first time, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The days following Maria's registration were filled with whispers and stares. Whenever the nuns walked through the village to buy supplies, people would point at them and talk behind their hands. Some villagers offered words of encouragement, telling the sisters they would be praying for Maria's success. Others shook their heads and muttered about foolish women making themselves targets for humiliation. The attention was uncomfortable, but Sister Agnes reminded Maria that being watched by others was part of the journey. The true test was staying focused on what mattered. Giuseppe was handling the situation badly. Ever since he heard about Maria's registration, he had become restless and irritable. He would snap at his friends for no reason. He would drink more wine than usual at the tavern. He would pace around his garage, unable to concentrate on his work. His friends tried to reassure him that there was nothing to worry about. They said no nun who had been hiding in a convent could compete against professional musicians. They said Giuseppe would win the bet easily and have a great story to tell for years. But something in Giuseppe's gut told him this was different. Elena noticed the change in her brother immediately. She knew him better than anyone, and she could see the fear hiding behind his loud confidence. One evening, she visited his small house and found him sitting alone in the dark, staring at an old photograph. It was a picture of their mother, who had died 20 years ago. Elena sat down beside him and asked what was troubling him. Giuseppe did not answer at first. Then, in a quiet voice she had not heard in years, he admitted that he was scared. Not scared of losing the bet, but scared of what winning or losing might mean for his soul. Giuseppe told Elena something he had never shared before. He said that on the night his wife died, he had made a bargain with God. He had promised that if God saved her life, he would become the most devoted believer in the world. But God did not save her. She died in his arms while he screamed for help that never came. After that, Giuseppe decided that God was either cruel or fake, and he chose to believe that God was fake because that hurt less. He built walls around his heart and filled his life with noise and laughter to avoid the silence where grief lived. Elena listened to her brother's confession with tears running down her cheeks. She held his hand and told him that she understood his pain. She said that faith is not about never having doubts. Faith is about holding on even when everything seems hopeless. She said that perhaps God was using this bet to give Giuseppe another chance. Perhaps the nun with the piano was an answer to prayers that Elena had been saying for years. Giuseppe pulled away and laughed bitterly. He said that was exactly the kind of foolish thinking he could never accept. But later that night, when he was alone in his bed, he found himself whispering something that might have been a prayer. Back at the convent, Maria was entering the most intense phase of her preparation. She had chosen the pieces she would play at the competition. The first would be a Chopin nocturne, gentle and full of melancholy. The second would be a Beethoven sonata, powerful and dramatic. The third, if there was time, would be a piece her father had composed just for her, a melody that had never been performed in public. This third piece was the most personal and the most difficult. Maria had not played it since before the accident, and she was not sure if she could get through it without falling apart. The pressure was enormous, and it began to show in Maria's health. She was not sleeping well, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. She was not eating properly, and her already slim body became thinner. Sister Agnes grew worried and insisted that Maria take better care of herself. She assigned Sister Rosa to make sure Maria ate 3 proper meals every day. She limited Maria's practice time to prevent exhaustion. She reminded Maria that God did not need a broken vessel to carry his music into the world. One afternoon, a surprise visitor arrived at the convent. His name was Professor Alessandro Marino, and he was one of the judges for their Christmas competition. Professor Marino was a respected music critic from Rome who had heard rumors about the nun who had registered. He was curious and slightly skeptical. He asked the Mother Superior if he could hear the nun play, just to see if the rumors had any truth. Sister Agnes invited him into the main hall and sent someone to fetch Maria. When Maria entered the hall and saw the distinguished professor sitting beside the piano, her heart nearly stopped. She had heard of Alessandro Marino. Her father had mentioned him many times, calling him one of the most important voices in Italian classical music. Now this man was here in her convent, waiting to judge whether she was worthy of his attention. Maria's hands began to shake, and for a moment she wanted to run away. But then she remembered her father's words. He always said that nerves were just excitement wearing a disguise. She took a deep breath and walked toward the piano. Professor Marino watched Maria carefully as she sat down and positioned her fingers on the keys. He noticed the simple brown habit she wore, so different from the glamorous outfits of the musicians he usually judged. He noticed the quiet determination in her eyes, mixed with something he could not quite identify. He nodded for her to begin, and Maria started to play the Chopin Nocturne. The first notes floated into the air like whispered secrets. Professor Marino leaned forward in his chair, his skeptical expression slowly changing to one of wonder. This was not what he expected. This was not the amateur playing of a religious woman with too much time on her hands. This was genuine artistry. This was the touch of someone who had been trained by masters and had suffered deeply enough to understand what Chopin was trying to say. As Maria played, the professor felt something he had not felt in years. He felt moved. When Maria finished the nocturne, there was silence in the hall. Professor Marino did not speak for a long moment. Then he asked Maria where she had learned to play like that. Maria told him about her father, about the lessons that had begun when she was still a small child, about the concerts and the promises of a brilliant future. She told him about the accident, about losing her father and nearly losing her hands. She told him about the years of silence and the painful decision to play again. Professor Marino listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up and walked to the window. Looking out at the garden dot, he told Maria that he had been judging music competitions for 30 years. He had heard thousands of talented musicians perform, but rarely, perhaps only a handful of times, had he heard someone play with such pure emotional truth. He said that Maria had something special, something that could not be taught in any conservatory. He said that the competition would be difficult because she would face trained professionals with decades of experience. But he believed that if Maria played with the same heart she had just shown him, she had a real chance of winning dot before he left. Professor Marino gave Maria some advice. He told her not to try to impress the judges with technical perfection. He said the other competitors would likely be more polished than her. Instead, he said she should play from her soul and tell her story through the music. He said the audience would feel her truth even if they did not know her history. He said that authentic emotion is the rarest and most valuable gift a musician can offer. Maria thanked him with tears in her eyes. Sister Agnes shook his hand and thanked God for sending this encouragement when they needed it most. The news of Professor Marino's visit quickly reached the village. People who worked at the convent as gardeners and cleaners spread the word about what they had heard and seen. They said the professor had been amazed. They said he had stayed for over an hour listening to the nun play. They said he had left with a look of wonder on his face. The villagers who had doubted Maria began to wonder if perhaps they had misjudged her. Giuseppe heard the news at the tavern and went home early. Unable to pretend that everything was fine anymore in her room that night, Maria knelt beside her bed and prayed for the first time since she was a child. She thanked God for bringing her to this moment. She asked for the strength to honor her father's memory. She asked for the courage to face whatever was coming. And in the quiet darkness of her room, she felt a peace that she had not known in years. The competition was 1 month away. Maria was ready to fight for her dream. December arrived with cold wines and gray skies. The village of San Lorenzo transformed into a winter wonderland as Christmas decorations appeared on every street corner. Colored lights hung from windows and the smell of holiday baking filled the air. But beneath the festive atmosphere, tension was building. The music competition was now just 2 weeks away, and the whole village seemed to be holding its breath. Maria had reached a critical point in her preparation. She could play the Chopin and Beethoven pieces almost perfectly now, her fingers remembering the movements as if the years of silence had never happened. But the third piece, her father's composition, remained a challenge. Every time she tried to play it, emotions would overwhelm her and she would have to stop. Sister Agnes told her that it was acceptable to perform only 2 pieces. Many competitors would do the same. But Maria insisted that she needed to play her father's music. She said it was the only way to truly complete her journey. The other competitors began arriving in San Lorenzo from all over Italy. They came with their fancy clothes, their expensive instruments, their managers and assistants. They booked the best rooms at the village inn and walked through the streets with the confidence of people who expected to win. There were 12 competitors in total, each one accomplished and ambitious. They included a young prodigy from Milan who had been featured in national newspapers, a seasoned concert pianist from Florence who had performed at famous halls across Europe, and a dramatic woman from Naples who was known for her passionate interpretations. When these competitors heard about the nun who had entered, most of them laughed. They saw her as a joke, a local curiosity that would provide entertainment before the real competition began. Some of them made cruel comments within earshot of the convent. Knowing their words would reach Maria, they said she should stick to praying because the piano required real talent. They said the judges would be embarrassed to watch her fail. They said entering this competition was an insult to serious musicians everywhere. Maria heard these comments and they hurt. She was tempted to believe the doubters, to tell herself that she was foolish for thinking she could compete against trained professionals. But then she would remember her father's face, the pride in his eyes when she performed, and she would find the courage to continue. Sister Agnes reminded her that those who mock others usually do so because they are afraid themselves. True artists do not need to tear down their competitors. They let their music speak for them. Giuseppe was going through his own transformation during these weeks. His sister Elena had invited him to attend Mass on the first Sunday of December, and to everyone's surprise, he agreed. He sat in the back of the church, looking uncomfortable and out of place, but he stayed for the entire service. The priest noticed him and smiled, but did not make a fuss. Sometimes the prodigal son needs to return quietly, without fanfare or judgment. After the service, Giuseppe found himself walking past the convent. He did not plan to stop, but his feet seemed to have a mind of their own. He stood outside the walls, listening, and then he heard it. Piano music was floating through an open window, beautiful and sad and somehow full of hope at the same time. Giuseppe stood frozen, unable to move as the melody wrapped around his heart. Tears that he had been holding back for 10 years suddenly spilled down his cheeks. He did not understand what was happening to him. He only knew that something inside him was breaking open. Inside the convent, Maria was unaware of her listener. She was lost in her father's composition, finally able to play it from beginning to end without falling apart. The breakthrough had come that morning when she realized something important. The piece was not about sadness. It was about love. Her father had written it to celebrate Maria's gift, to capture in music everything he felt when he watched her play. The melody was his love letter to his daughter, and playing it was Maria's way of writing back. This understanding changed everything. The grief did not disappear, but it transformed into something beautiful. The final days before the competition were filled with nervous energy. Sister Agnes organized special prayer sessions for Maria's success. The village priest offered to bless Maria's hands before she performed. Even some villagers who had been skeptical began showing quiet support, leaving flowers and encouraging notes at the convent gate. The doubters remained loud, but the believers were growing stronger. Giuseppe attended Mass again on the second Sunday of December. This time he sat a little closer to the front. His sister Elena sat beside him, her heart overflowing with joy. She did not say anything about his change because she knew that transformation must unfold in its own time. But she prayed silently, thanking God for whatever miracle was happening in her brother's hardened heart. The professional competitors, meanwhile, were conducting their final rehearsals at the village theater where the competition would be held. Maria had not yet seen the venue, and Sister Agnes decided it was time. One afternoon she took Maria to the theater for a private viewing. The building was grand and old, with velvet seats and golden decorations covering the walls. A magnificent grand piano stood at the center of the stage, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Maria walked slowly toward the stage, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. She climbed the steps and stood before the piano, looking out at the empty seats that would soon be filled with people. Her legs felt weak, and her breathing became shallow. This was so much bigger than anything she had experienced since the accident. This was a real concert hall, a real competition, with real judges who would decide her fate. For a moment, panic threatened to consume her. Sister Agnes joined her on the stage and took her hand. She told Maria to close her eyes and imagine that her father was sitting in the first row. She told her to imagine that all the empty seats were filled with people who loved her, people who wanted her to succeed. She told her that the audience would include not just villagers but angels as well, watching from a place beyond sight. Maria did as she was told. She closed her eyes and filled the theater with loving faces. Her panic slowly subsided, replaced by a strange calm. The day before the competition, something unexpected happened. Maria received a letter. It was delivered by a nervous young man who said it had been sent from Rome. Sister Agnes was suspicious at first, worried that someone might be trying to sabotage Maria with cruel words. But when Maria opened the envelope and began to read, her face changed from confusion to shock to overwhelming emotion. The letter was from her father's oldest student, a man named Lorenzo who had become a famous conductor. Lorenzo had somehow heard about Maria's return to music and her entry into the competition. He wrote that he had always wondered what happened to his teacher's brilliant daughter. He said that when he heard she was going to perform again, he wept with joy. He said that Antonio Benedetta was the greatest teacher he had ever known, and that Antonio's spirit lived on in Maria's music. He said he would be praying for her success, and he hoped that one day she would perform with his orchestra. Maria read the letter 3 times before she could speak. This message from the past felt like a sign from heaven. Her father's legacy was still alive in the world. People still remembered him, still respected him, still carried his teachings in their hearts and hands. Maria's performance was not just about her own healing. It was about honoring a man who had touched so many lives with his love of music. That night, Maria slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. She dreamed of her father. In the dream, he was sitting at their old piano in Rome, and she was a little girl again, climbing onto his lap to learn a new song. He smiled at her with such love that her heart ached. Then he whispered something in her ear. He told her that he was proud of her. He told her that she had always had the strength to overcome anything. He told her to play tomorrow not for the judges or the audience or the doubters, but for the music itself. The music deserved to be heard. When Maria woke up, the sun was rising over San Lorenzo, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The day of the competition had finally arrived. The final competitors performed after Maria, but the audience remained distracted. People whispered among themselves about what they had witnessed. The young prodigy from Milan played brilliantly, his technical skill undeniable. The concert pianist from Florence gave a polished performance that earned respectful applause. But everyone knew in their hearts that something special had happened when the nun in the brown habit sat down at the piano. The remaining performers were competing for second place. The judges retired to a private room to make their decision. The competition rules required a written evaluation of each performer, which made the deliberation take longer than usual. The audience waited restlessly, buying refreshments and debating among themselves. The professional competitors huddled together, their earlier confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty. Sister Agnes led the nuns in quiet prayer, asking only that God's will be done or passed before the judges emerged from their deliberation room. Professor Marino held the sealed envelope containing their decision. He walked to the center of the stage and asked everyone to take their seats. The theater fell silent as 500 people held their breath. Professor Marino spoke slowly and deliberately. He said this had been one of the most remarkable competitions he had witnessed in 30 years of judging. He said the level of talent was exceptional across all participants. He praised several performers by name, noting their technical achievements and artistic interpretations. Then his voice grew softer, more personal. He said there were moments in music that transcended technique. He said there were performances that touched something deeper than skill, reaching into the very essence of what it means to be human. He said one performer today had achieved that rare and precious thing. She had played not just with her fingers but with her soul. Her music had moved the judges to tears, something that had never happened before in the history of this competition. The theater was completely silent as Professor Marino opened the envelope. He announced that the winner of the San Lorenzo Christmas music competition was Sister Maria Benedetta of the Convent of the Sacred Heart. The theater exploded with celebration. People cheered and cried and embraced each other. The nuns jumped up and down with joy, forgetting for a moment their usual composure. Maria sat stunned, unable to process what was happening. Sister Agnes had to guide her to the stage to receive the award. She walked as if in a dream, her feet barely touching the ground. Professor Marino placed a golden medal around Maria's neck and handed her a beautiful crystal trophy. He shook her hand and whispered that her father would have been incredibly proud. Maria managed to thank him through her tears. She turned to face the audience and saw a sea of faces filled with joy. In that moment, she understood that she had not won just for herself. She had won for everyone who had ever been. Afraid to follow their dreams, the celebration continued after the formal ceremony ended. Villagers lined up to congratulate Maria and the other nuns. Photographers snapped pictures that would appear in newspapers the next morning. Even the competitors who had lost came to shake Maria's hand, admitting that she had earned her victory. The young prodigy from Milan asked if she would consider teaching him someday. Maria laughed and said she was still learning herself. Giuseppe remained in his seat throughout the celebration, unable to move. His sister Elena stayed beside him, patient and understanding. When the theater finally began to empty, Giuseppe stood on shaky legs and walked toward the stage. Maria saw him approaching and felt nervous despite her victory. She remembered his cruel words over the years, his mocking laughter outside the convent walls. She did not know what to expect from this man who had caused so much pain. Giuseppe stopped a few feet from Maria and looked at her with eyes that seemed different than before. The bitterness was gone. The anger had faded. In their place was something that looked almost like peace. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He said he had made a bet. He said that if a nun played the piano at this competition, he would repent. He said he was a man of his word, even when the word was spoken in foolishness. But then he paused and shook his head. He said the truth was more complicated than a simple bet. He said her music had opened something inside him that had been closed for 10 years. He said he heard his wife's voice in the melody, telling him it was time to let go of his pain. He said he did not know how to be a believer, not anymore, but he wanted to try. Maria listened to Giuseppe's words with tears streaming down her face. She saw before her a broken man trying to piece himself back together. She saw the same journey she had been walking for the past months. She reached out and took his hands in hers. She told him that faith was not about knowing all the answers. Faith was about being willing to ask the questions. She told him that God had not given up on him. Even when he had given up on God, she invited him to come to the convent chapel whenever he needed peace. The doors would always be open. Giuseppe nodded, too emotional to speak. His sister Elena embraced Maria, thanking her for what she had done for her brother. The other villagers who had witnessed this exchange felt their hearts grow warm. They had come to see a music competition but had witnessed something far more profound. They had seen the power of grace in action. The days that followed were filled with wonder. News of Maria's victory spread beyond San Lorenzo. Reaching newspapers in Rome and Milan, journalists came to interview the nun who had defeated professional musicians. Music teachers discussed her performance in amazement. The conductor Lorenzo, who had sent the encouraging letter, invited Maria to perform with his orchestra in the spring. Her life was transforming in ways she had never imagined. Giuseppe kept his promise. He began attending Mass every Sunday, sitting a little closer to the front each week. He apologized to every nun in the convent for his years of insults. He even began volunteering at the convent, helping to repair things and tend the garden. The other villagers watched his transformation with wonder. The man who had been the loudest critic of faith was becoming its most humble. Christmas arrived a week after the competition, and it was the most joyful holiday San Lorenzo had ever known. The church was packed for midnight mass. The priest spoke about miracles and the power of redemption. He mentioned Maria's victory and Giuseppe's conversion, calling them examples of God's mysterious work. The congregation sang carols with unusual enthusiasm, their voices rising like prayers toward heaven after Mass. The nuns hosted a small celebration at the convent. They opened their doors to the villagers, serving simple food and warm drinks. Maria played Christmas carols on the piano while everyone sang along. Giuseppe stood near the back, still shy about his new place in the community, but his face was lit with genuine happiness. Elena stood beside him, grateful beyond words for the miracle of her brother's return. As the night grew late and the guests began leaving, Sister Agnes took Maria aside for a private word. The old woman's eyes were shining with tears and love. She told Maria that her journey was just beginning. She said the world needed her music, needed her story, needed the proof that broken things could be made whole again. She said Maria should not feel guilty about seeking opportunities beyond the convent walls. God could be served in many ways, and Maria's instrument of service was the piano. Maria thanked Sister Agnes for everything. She thanked her for believing in her when she could not believe in herself. She thanked her for pushing her to face her fears. She thanked her for being the mother she had lost so long ago. The two women embraced, their tears mingling with their laughter. Months later, Maria stood on a stage in Rome, preparing to perform with Lorenzo's orchestra. The concert hall was magnificent, filled with thousands of people who had come to hear the nun who had conquered doubt and grief. Among the audience sat Sister Agnes, Giuseppe, Elena, and dozens of villagers from San Lorenzo. They had traveled together to support their beloved Maria on this grand occasion. As the orchestra began to play, Maria placed her hands on the keys of a Steinway grand piano. She thought of her father, of his love and his lessons and his unshakable faith in her. She thought of the difficult journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of all the people who had doubted her and all the people who had believed. Then she began to play, and the music soared into the air like a bird finally set free. In the audience, Giuseppe closed his eyes and let the melody wash over him. He thought of his wife, no longer with pain but with gratitude for the years they had shared. He thought of the bet that had changed his life, the foolish words that had opened the door to his salvation. He thought of God, no longer with anger but with tentative trust. And in the golden light of the concert hall, surrounded by people he loved, Giuseppe finally understood that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as impossible challenges. All we have to do is find the courage to face them. The music continued, filling the hall with beauty and hope, reaching beyond the walls to touch anyone who needed to hear it. Maria played for her father, for Sister Agnes, for Giuseppe, for every person who had ever been told they were not good enough. She played for the doubters who needed proof and the believers who needed encouragement. She played for herself,